After months of campaigning and campaign ads, the election is over. Whether your candidate won or lost, we're all still trying to figure out what it means to our democracy, our nation, and our state. Joining us to help us sort through what's happened and what's next is Dr. Mordecai Lee, a former Wisconsin state legislator serving in both the Assembly and the Senate. He is a professor emeritus at UW-M, where his work is focused on governmental affairs. He's the author of 11 books and has appeared on NBC, Fox, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and has been interviewed by a number of other news organizations, including the New York Times, the Associated Press, and Reuters. Mordecai, we are so happy to have you with us, and we appreciate you being able to help us kind of sort this out after a very long election season.
Thank you, Denise. Glad to be here.
What do the results of the November 5th election tell us about America that we did not know on November 4th?
Well, politics is a little bit like an onion. You know, you peel off the layers, then there's another layer, you peel that one off. So I don't think there's one single sort of glib answer that can be said about the election. I mean, I know the national media, the Capitol Press Corps, they love these sort of simplistic explanations, very facile. I think it's complicated, but for the purposes of this, our conversation, I want to dig way down into one of the layers that's not as obvious. It seems to me that this election was a referendum on inflation, because to a lot of people, going to the grocery store was a gut check. It hit them every time they went to the grocery store, they were spending more. Now, occasionally, prices that had been at a high level came down, eggs, gas, or whatever it might be. But generally speaking, grocery prices have gone up 5% a year for the 4 years of Joe Biden. In other words, people today in Wisconsin are roughly paying 20% more than they were paying 4 years ago. And I think that gets to the heart of the election. That for so many Americans, so many Wisconsinites, they don't feel that their income kept up with inflation. Now, you could have an economist sit down with a table and show them statistics. And maybe their buying power is the same. Maybe even their buying power based on salary raises have kept up or exceeded inflation. But it didn't feel that way to them. And when Donald Trump said, I'm going to go back to the good old days, to this category of the population, the good old days was the years of low inflation that everybody associates with the final Obama years and the Trump years until COVID. Low interest rates, low inflation, low mortgage rates. This was sort of the ideal time for so many Americans. And as much as Joe Biden or Kamala Harris would try to explain it, it didn't feel that way. And I think, frankly, that's the ultimate reason why Trump won.
But there were a lot of issues that were raised that impact people's lives as much as inflation did. Reproductive rights, that was a big issue. And there were some successes in individual states where reproductive rights were restored or enhanced. That did not seem to be the driver that folks thought it would be.
That's right. If we want to say it simplistically, the presidential election was a referendum between grocery prices, vote Trump, or reproductive rights, vote Harris. And grocery prices won. Now, were there people in those specific states that had referenda who voted for Trump and then for abortion rights? Presumably, yes, because it passed in more states than it failed. But that, in a sense, took the abortion issue away from how they were going to vote for president. So in their state, they could have reproductive rights, and then they could vote for Trump. Maybe what it's coming down to is that the Republican Party under Trump has become the party of the working people, of the proletariat. And these were the ones who were just killed by inflation, or at least they felt like they were being killed by inflation. And on the other hand, the Democratic Party has become the party of college graduates who have white-collar jobs. And for a lot of white-collar people, they either knew that their salaries were rising to keep up with inflation, or they understood that inflation was slowing down. But to the working class, inflation slowing down is still inflation. And I think if we keep peeling back the onion, and maybe I'm focusing too much on this one issue, it was the Federal Reserve that right after COVID kept telling us that inflation was transitory. And Biden, the Secretary of the Treasury, a former Fed chair, kept telling us it was transitory. And everybody thought transitory meant that they would drop back to where they were before COVID and before the shortages and the logistical supply issues. And transitory did not mean that. It simply meant that the rate of inflation would gradually slow down. So I think in a nutshell, as simplistic as I'm sounding, I think that's the key explanation.
The outcome is one, though, where, as you've described it, it's almost like we had two Americas, right? Two visions of America that people saw. I think there are other folks who would agree with you on that. So what do we do now? How do we get back to being Americans who are looking at the big picture and perhaps even how it impacts other people, as opposed to where we are today, where it seems very, pardon me, self-centered?
I think the short answer is beats me. But if we look at history, for example, after the Republican Party got killed in the 1964 election because Goldwater was too conservative, and everybody said, well, that's it. That's the end of the Republican Party. And 4 years later, Richard Nixon gets elected president. And there have been times, for example, 4 years ago, Trump loses the election to Biden, and people said, okay, that's the end of Trump republicanism. Well, no, it wasn't. So I think based on American history, we can think of the Democratic Party becoming more competitive and somehow transforming itself back to, for example, the Franklin Roosevelt coalition. Franklin Roosevelt coalition was labor unions, workers in general, and then some negative members of the coalition, the racist Southerners who controlled segregation in the South, and sort of the urban progressives. And somehow there's a need to reach not the unionized working class, but the non-unionized working class. Rural, blue-collar, only high school education, and that often can describe men who are in manual labor. But if we talk about women, rural, non-college graduates, lower income, we're probably talking pink collar. In other words, they work in various services that also get really hit hard by inflation. So somehow the Democratic Party has got to figure out how to appeal to more than just college graduates. And I'm not sure where the magic is. Maybe it's the right candidate. Maybe it's the right mix of policy. But they've really got to talk to people at their kitchen table. They've really got to talk to people about things people care about and not lecturing them that they're as good off as they were, let's say, before Biden became president.
Two things that happen to Democrats that make you think that they've really got to figure something out is they lost the blue wall states. And secondly, that shift that seems to be pretty seismic with Latino men and a surprising smaller shift, but a shift nonetheless, of African American men.
That's so interesting because, we're coming out of an era of what was called identity politics. And when we made these gross generalizations about populations, for example, all African Americans are Democrats. No, first of all, because the African American population was very heterogeneous. College graduates, non-college graduates, whatever it might be. People who go to church, people who don't go to church. And so the issue of identity politics has apparently dissipated. And I like your two examples. So you have a Latino young men and you have Black young men who know they're Black or Latino and they're proud to be Black and Latino, but that's not enough of a reason for who they vote for. And so when they're thinking about what party will protect me, stabilize my economic situation, improve my economic situation, get me back to where I was 4 years ago, they didn't have any problem voting for a Republican candidate as opposed to a Democratic candidate.
President Biden really recently spoke about the results of the election, and I was really struck by one thing he said. He said, we should not see each other as adversaries, but as fellow Americans. With as bitter as this campaign was, and with some of the things that were said, how do we get there? Can we do that? And what happens if we can't?
You know, it's a wonderful thought and a wonderful aspiration. And I think that actually most Americans could generally, in the abstract, agree with that. But that's not much of a pull compared to, let's say, inflation or people feeling that the Democratic Party is out of touch with their needs, whatever it might be. But the thing to remember about American culture is that we have very short memories. And 2 years from now, 4 years from now, it might feel entirely different. Now, I don't want to wish ill on President Trump because I want to have the same aspiration that President Biden had expressed. But it's possible that President Trump's presidency for the next 2 years, for the next 4 years, will lead people to reevaluate which party gives them the best opportunity for advancement towards the American dream and which doesn't, or which candidate, what personality they would want to vote for or not vote for. So I think it's almost like every presidential election wipes the slate clean, in particular because 4 years from now would be the end of the Trump presidency. And so I think we can assume that Republicans and Democrats need to engage in long-term economic planning about their agenda that would be effective and helpful and concrete and tangible for the average American.
Mordecai, there's a lot to unpack from the last campaign and from the results of the campaign. We so appreciate you being here to help us have a better understanding of what happened and, as you just outlined, hopefully a way forward. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're back in just a minute.